In June of 1763, at Fort Pitt on the western frontier of colonial America, a British captain named Simeon Ecuyer made a decision that would unleash one of history's most deliberate acts of biological warfare. As Native American warriors surrounded his undermanned fort during Pontiac's war, Ecuyer ordered his men to take blankets and a handkerchief from the fort's smallpox hospital and present them as gifts to the besieging Delaware chiefs during peace negotiations. This wasn't an act of generosity. It was a calculated attempt to infect and exterminate entire tribes using one of the deadliest diseases known to 18th-century medicine. The horrifying truth is that this genocidal tactic was not only executed, but explicitly endorsed in writing by British military leadership, making it one of the few documented cases of intentional biological warfare in the colonial era. To understand how British officers arrived at such a monstrous strategy, we must first examine the desperate military situation they faced in the spring and summer of 1763. Pontiac's war erupted when a confederation of Native American tribes, led by the Ottawa war chief Pontiac, launched coordinated attacks against British forts and settlements across the Great Lakes region and Ohio Valley. Within weeks, native forces had captured 8 British forts and killed hundreds of settlers and soldiers. Fort Pitt, located at the strategic confluence of 3 rivers in what is now Pittsburgh, became one of the most important British strongholds under siege. The fort's commander, Captain Simeon Ecuyer, found himself vastly outnumbered by Delaware and Shawnee warriors who had cut off supply lines and were slowly starving the garrison into submission. British commanders thousands of miles away in the eastern colonies were receiving reports of catastrophic losses and growing panic among frontier settlers. The British military establishment quickly recognized that conventional warfare against native forces in the wilderness was proving disastrously ineffective. General Jeffery Amherst, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, was receiving weekly reports of British defeats and the capture of frontier forts. Amherst, a decorated veteran of European warfare, was utterly frustrated by his army's inability to decisively defeat native warriors who employed guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. In his correspondence with subordinate officers, Amherst began to express increasingly genocidal sentiments toward native peoples, referring to them as vermin that needed to be exterminated rather than negotiated with. This racist dehumanization would prove critical in removing any moral restraints against using disease as a weapon. By early summer of 1763, Amherst was actively soliciting ideas from his officers about unconventional methods to eliminate native resistance, and his correspondence reveals a man willing to embrace any tactic, no matter how barbaric, to achieve military victory. On June 29, 1763, General Amherst wrote a letter to Colonel Henry Bouquet that would become the most damning piece of evidence of intentional biological warfare in early American history. In this correspondence, Amherst explicitly suggested using smallpox as a weapon against native tribes. His exact words were chilling in their casual cruelty, asking Bouquet whether it would not be possible to send smallpox among the disaffected tribes of Indians and suggesting they try every stratagem to reduce the native population. Bouquet responded enthusiastically to his commander's suggestion, stating he would attempt to spread the disease through blankets, though he expressed concern about his own men becoming infected in the process. This exchange, preserved in official British military archives, demolishes any modern attempt to deny or minimize the intentional nature of smallpox distribution. These were not rogue soldiers acting independently. This was a coordinated military strategy approved at the highest levels of British command in North America. What made smallpox such an attractive weapon to British commanders was their understanding of its devastating effectiveness against Native American populations who had no prior exposure or immunity to the disease. European and colonial populations had lived with smallpox for centuries, and while it remained deadly, many adults had survived childhood infections and acquired immunity. Native American peoples, however, existed in virgin soil populations that had never been exposed to old-world diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus. When smallpox entered native communities, mortality rates frequently exceeded 50% and sometimes reached 90% in completely naive populations. British military doctors and officers were well aware of this epidemiological vulnerability. They had witnessed smallpox epidemics sweep through native villages with apocalyptic efficiency during previous decades. The disease didn't just kill, it killed in ways that destroyed social structures, leaving tribes unable to hunt, gather food, care for their sick, or defend their territories. For British commanders seeking to eliminate native resistance, smallpox offered a weapon far more effective than muskets or artillery. The mechanics of smallpox transmission made contaminated blankets a theoretically viable delivery system for the virus, though the actual effectiveness remains debated by historians. Smallpox is caused by the variola virus, which can survive on fabrics and surfaces for limited periods under certain conditions. Hospital bedding and clothing from smallpox patients would be heavily contaminated with viral particles from the characteristic pustules that covered victims' bodies. The disease spreads primarily through prolonged face-to-face contact and respiratory droplets, but transmission through contaminated materials was considered possible, especially if the recipient had direct contact with fresh scabs or fluid from pustules embedded in the fabric. British medical knowledge in the 1760s understood these basic transmission routes, even without modern virology. Fort Pitt maintained a smallpox hospital to quarantine infected soldiers, providing a ready source of contaminated materials. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity: take bedding and clothing from dying smallpox patients, present them as diplomatic gifts to native leaders, and let the disease do what British muskets could not. The actual execution of the smallpox blanket distribution at Fort Pitt is documented in the Journal of William Trent, a trader and militia captain who was present during the siege. Trent's journal entry from June 24, 1763, provides a chillingly matter-of-fact account of the deed. He recorded that during a parley with Delaware chiefs Turtle's Heart and Mamalty, the British gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief that had been taken from the smallpox hospital. The entry notes that the British hoped the gifts would have the desired effect, a euphemism for hoping they would spread the disease. This wasn't a secret operation or a later fabrication. It was recorded in contemporary documents by multiple witnesses. Captain Ecuyer later submitted an invoice to the British military requesting reimbursement for the items taken from the smallpox hospital and distributed to the natives. The bureaucratic paper trail of genocide includes itemized lists of contaminated blankets and their stated purpose. The casual administrative tone of these documents reveals how normalized and acceptable this form of biological warfare had become to British colonial officers. The medical reality of smallpox infection was a prolonged nightmare that began deceptively with symptoms resembling a common illness. After exposure to the variola virus, victims experienced an incubation period of 7 to 17 days, during which they showed no symptoms but could still spread the disease. The first signs appeared suddenly with high fever, severe headache, body aches, and sometimes vomiting. For 2 to 3 days, infected individuals felt violently ill but showed no distinctive marks. Then came the rash, beginning in the mouth and throat before spreading across the face and then the entire body. Within days, the rash transformed into raised bumps that filled with thick opaque fluid, creating the characteristic pustules that gave smallpox its name. These pustules covered every inch of the victim's body, including inside the mouth, throat, and even the eyes. The pain was excruciating as thousands of these lesions pressed against nerve endings. Victims often could not eat, drink, or sleep due to the agony. The pustules would eventually scab over, but this process took weeks, during which secondary infections frequently set in. The mortality rate from smallpox varied depending on the strain and the victim's health, but among Native American populations with no prior exposure, death rates were catastrophically high. The most deadly form, hemorrhagic smallpox, caused bleeding under the skin and from mucous membranes, essentially causing victims to bleed to death internally. Flat-type smallpox produced pustules that merged into sheets of infected tissue that would slough off the body. But even survivors of ordinary smallpox faced horrific consequences. The disease commonly caused blindness when pustules formed on and destroyed the corneas. Deep pitting scars covered survivors' faces and bodies for life, the permanent marks of the disease. Many survivors lost fingers or toes to gangrene when circulation was compromised. Pregnant women frequently miscarried. Perhaps most devastatingly for tribal communities, smallpox killed without regard for age or status, taking warriors, chiefs, elders, and children with equal efficiency. The disease didn't just reduce native populations numerically, it destroyed the cultural knowledge carried by elders and the military capacity represented by warriors in their prime. Historical evidence suggests that a smallpox epidemic did strike Native American tribes in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region in the summer and fall of 1763, though definitively linking it to the Fort Pitt blankets remains challenging. William Trent's journal mentions that smallpox had already appeared among the natives around Fort Pitt before the blanket distribution, suggesting multiple possible sources of infection. However, the timing and geographic spread of the 1763 epidemic aligned disturbingly well with the British biological warfare attempts. Delaware, Shawnee, and Mingo villages along the Ohio River reported devastating outbreaks beginning in July and August of 1763. Jesuit missionaries working among native communities documented apocalyptic scenes of entire villages decimated by the disease. Mortality estimates for some communities reached 80 to 90%. Warriors who had been besieging British forts suddenly disappeared as the epidemic forced them to return to dying villages. The epidemic effectively accomplished what British military force had failed to achieve, breaking the back of native resistance in the region. The scope of Native American deaths from the 1763 smallpox epidemic across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley region was staggering, though exact numbers remain impossible to determine with precision. Conservative estimates from historians suggest that tens of thousands of Native Americans died in the epidemic that swept through the region from 1763 through 1765. Some tribal communities lost more than half their population. The Ottawa, Ojibwa, Potawatomi, Delaware, Shawnee, Mingo, and Wyandot tribes all reported catastrophic losses. Entire villages were abandoned when so many died that survivors fled in terror, leaving their dead unburied. The epidemic spread far beyond the initial point of contact at Fort Pitt, carried by traders, warriors, and refugees to tribes across hundreds of miles. Some historians estimate that up to 100,000 Native Americans may have died in the broader epidemic wave that followed, though separating deaths directly attributable to the Fort Pitt incident from other concurrent outbreaks remains methodologically difficult. What is undeniable is that British military leaders attempted to weaponize disease against native populations, and that a devastating epidemic followed soon after. The military and strategic consequences of the 1763 epidemic were exactly what General Amherst had hoped for when he endorsed biological warfare. Pontiac's Confederacy, which had been successfully besieging British forts and terrorizing frontier settlements, began to collapse as warriors were forced to abandon military campaigns to return to plague-stricken villages. The siege of Fort Pitt was lifted as Delaware and Shawnee forces melted away. British forces were able to resupply their western forts and resume offensive operations against weakened native resistance. By the fall of 1763, the military situation had reversed dramatically in Britain's favor, not through superior tactics or bravery, but through disease that had hollowed out native military capacity. Pontiac's war would continue sporadically until 1766, but the Confederacy never regained its initial momentum or coordination. British officials privately celebrated the epidemic's military benefits. In their correspondence, officers noted with satisfaction that the pestilence had done more to advance British interests than a year of conventional military campaigns. The success of biological warfare at Fort Pitt established a horrifying precedent that would be remembered if not always acknowledged in subsequent conflicts. The Fort Pitt incident was not an isolated case, but rather the most well-documented example of a broader British willingness to use disease as a weapon against Native Americans. Historical research has uncovered evidence suggesting similar tactics may have been attempted or discussed at other locations during the 18th century. At Fort Dobbs in North Carolina, there are indications that British officers considered using smallpox-infected materials during conflicts with Cherokee tribes in 1759. In upstate New York during the French and Indian War, British commanders discussed strategies for spreading disease among French allied tribes. The key difference with Fort Pitt is the exceptional documentary evidence, the preserved letters and journal entries that prove beyond doubt the intentional nature of the biological attack. Many other suspected cases lack such definitive proof because officers were often careful not to create written records of actions they understood to be beyond the pale of acceptable warfare. The Fort Pitt documents survived largely because British military officers initially saw no need to hide their actions, operating in a colonial context where native lives were not valued, and biological warfare against indigenous peoples was not yet considered a war crime under European military law. The ethical implications of the smallpox blanket distribution extend far beyond 18th-century military conduct into the realm of genocide and crimes against humanity, as later defined by international law. The British actions at Fort Pitt meet multiple criteria for genocide under the 1948 United Nations Convention, including deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction of a group, in whole or in part. The premeditated nature of the attack, documented in written military correspondence, demonstrates clear intent to destroy Native American populations. This was not collateral damage from warfare or accidental disease transmission. It was calculated biological warfare directed at civilian populations with the explicit goal of extermination. Modern historical scholarship increasingly frames the smallpox blanket incident within the broader context of colonial genocide against indigenous peoples of North America. The tactic represented an early form of what would later be called ethnic cleansing, the systematic removal of an ethnic or racial group from a territory through violence, disease, and terror. The long-term demographic consequences of the 1763 epidemic and subsequent disease outbreaks contributed to a catastrophic Native American population collapse that would continue throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries. Tribes that had numbered in the tens of thousands before European contact were reduced to a few hundred survivors. The Delaware people, who had once dominated the mid-Atlantic region and Ohio Valley, saw their population devastated by repeated epidemics, of which the 1763 outbreak was among the most severe. The Shawnee similarly suffered population losses that permanently reduced their military and political power in the region. Beyond the immediate deaths, smallpox epidemics destroyed social structures, disrupted food production, killed knowledge keepers and leaders, and created psychological trauma that echoed through generations. Survivors were often left scarred, blind, or otherwise disabled. Communities lost the critical mass needed to maintain traditional ways of life. The demographic collapse made it impossible for native nations to effectively resist subsequent waves of European American settlement and forced removal policies. The smallpox blankets of 1763 were thus not just a wartime tactic, but a tool of colonial conquest that facilitated the theft of native lands and the destruction of indigenous civilizations. Despite the clear documentary evidence, the smallpox blanket incident has been subject to historical denial, minimization, and controversy that continues to the present day. Some revisionist historians have argued that the blankets may not have been effective vectors for disease transmission, or that smallpox was already present in native communities before the Fort Pitt distribution. These arguments, while technically raising valid questions about disease transmission mechanics, often serve to deflect attention from the undeniable historical fact that British military leaders attempted to deliberately spread a deadly disease to enemy populations. Whether the specific blankets distributed at Fort Pitt successfully transmitted smallpox is ultimately less important than the documented intent to commit biological warfare. The written evidence of General Amherst and Colonel Bouquet's correspondence proves conclusively that British military leadership endorsed and attempted genocide through disease. Other deniers have suggested that by 18th-century standards, such tactics were not considered war crimes. This argument fails both morally and historically, as even in the 1760s, military theorists and legal scholars considered poisoning and disease spreading to be violations of the laws of war that governed conduct between European powers. The reasons why the smallpox blanket incident remained relatively obscure in American historical consciousness for so long, reveal uncomfortable truths about how history is written and taught. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, American history was largely written from the perspective of European American settlers and presented westward expansion as inevitable progress and manifest destiny. Native American perspectives and experiences were marginalized or entirely excluded from mainstream historical narratives. Atrocities committed against indigenous peoples were downplayed, justified as necessary for civilization's advance, or simply omitted from textbooks and popular histories. The Fort Pitt incident, with its clear documentation of genocidal intent, was too inconvenient for narratives that portrayed American expansion as heroic or morally justified. It wasn't until the rise of Native American studies programs, ethnohistory as an academic discipline, and increased public awareness of indigenous rights in the late 20th century that incidents like the smallpox blanket distribution began receiving serious scholarly attention and entering public consciousness. The historical amnesia surrounding British biological warfare was not accidental, but rather reflected broader patterns of historical erasure that served to justify colonialism and absolve later generations of responsibility for genocidal policies. Modern scientific analysis of smallpox transmission has shed new light on the biological plausibility of blanket-based infection while also highlighting the complexities of determining the tactic's actual effectiveness. Virologists confirm that variola virus can survive on fabrics and fomites under certain conditions, particularly if the material is contaminated with fluid from fresh pustules or recently formed scabs. Laboratory studies have demonstrated that the virus remains viable on cloth for days to weeks, depending on environmental conditions like temperature and humidity. However, transmission via contaminated objects is generally less efficient than direct person-to-person contact through respiratory droplets. The likelihood of successful transmission through blankets would depend on multiple factors, including how recently the blankets had been used by infected individuals, how they were stored and transported, how much viral load was present on the fabric, and how quickly the recipients came into close contact with the contaminated materials. Some epidemiologists argue that the Fort Pitt blankets may have had limited direct impact because the virus might have degraded during handling and the summer heat of 1763. Others note that even a low probability of transmission could have successfully sparked an epidemic in a completely susceptible population. What remains indisputable is that British officers believed the tactic could work and deliberately attempted it with intent to kill. The Fort Pitt incident must be understood within the broader context of how disease functioned as the most devastating weapon in European colonization of the Americas. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, typhus, and other Old World diseases killed an estimated 50 to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas between 1492 and 1900. Most of these deaths resulted from unintentional disease transmission, as Europeans and Africans brought pathogens to which Native Americans had no immunity. However, the Fort Pitt case demonstrates that colonial powers were willing to intentionally weaponize disease when it served their strategic interests. The line between passive acceptance of epidemic mortality and active deployment of disease as a weapon was crossed when British officers made the conscious decision to use contaminated materials as instruments of war. This transforms the historical narrative from one of tragic but unavoidable disease exchange to one of deliberate biological warfare and genocide. It reveals that at least some European colonial leaders understood the devastating impact of disease on native populations and were willing to exploit this vulnerability without moral restraint. The smallpox blankets represent the moment when disease became not just a consequence of colonization, but a tool of colonial conquest. The legal and moral framework for understanding the smallpox blanket incident has evolved significantly since 1763, with modern international law explicitly prohibiting such actions as war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of biological weapons in warfare. The Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 went further, banning the development, production, and stockpiling of biological agents for hostile purposes. Under contemporary international humanitarian law, The deliberate spreading of disease among civilian populations constitutes a grave breach of the laws of war. The Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court defines as crimes against humanity acts such as murder, extermination, and persecution committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. The actions of General Amherst, Colonel Bouquet, and Captain Ecuyer would clearly meet these definitions if prosecuted under modern law. While we cannot retroactively apply 21st-century legal standards to 18th-century actions, examining the Fort Pitt incident through the lens of contemporary international law helps us understand the profound moral transgression it represented. It also establishes historical precedent for recognizing biological warfare against indigenous peoples as genocide. The legacy of the smallpox blanket incident extends into contemporary debates about historical memory, reparations, and the ongoing consequences of colonial violence against indigenous peoples. For many Native Americans, the Fort Pitt case symbolizes centuries of systematic attempts to eliminate indigenous populations through violence, disease, forced removal, and cultural destruction. The documented evidence of intentional biological warfare serves as proof that colonial genocide was not accidental or merely the unfortunate byproduct of cultural contact, but rather a deliberate policy pursued by colonial authorities. This historical reality has profound implications for contemporary discussions about land rights, treaty violations, and the debt owed by settler colonial societies to surviving indigenous communities. Some Native American activists and scholars argue that the smallpox blanket incident and similar atrocities should be taught as central rather than peripheral events in American history, forcing a reckoning with the genocidal foundations of the United States. They contend that historical amnesia about events like Fort Pitt allows contemporary society to avoid accountability for ongoing injustices faced by Native peoples. The demand is not merely for historical acknowledgement, but for material reparations and the return of stolen lands. The smallpox blanket incident also raises disturbing questions about the ethics of biological research and dual-use technologies that remain relevant in the 21st century. The same medical knowledge that allowed doctors to treat smallpox also enabled military officers to weaponize it. This dual-use dilemma, where scientific knowledge can serve both beneficial and destructive purposes, continues to haunt modern debates about biosecurity and biological research. Contemporary scientists working on vaccines and treatments for dangerous pathogens must grapple with the reality that their research could theoretically be misused to create biological weapons. The Fort Pitt case serves as a historical warning about how medical knowledge in the hands of those with genocidal intent becomes an instrument of mass death. It reminds us that ethical guardrails, international treaties, and vigilant oversight are necessary to prevent the weaponization of disease in modern conflicts. The specter of biological warfare has not disappeared. It has merely evolved with advances in biotechnology, making the lessons of 1763 disturbingly relevant to contemporary biosecurity challenges. In the final analysis, the smallpox blanket distribution at Fort Pitt in 1763 stands as one of the most clearly documented cases of intentional biological warfare in history and a stark example of colonial genocide against indigenous peoples. The written correspondence of General Jeffery Amherst and Colonel Henry Bouquet, combined with the journal entries of William Trent, provide irrefutable evidence that British military leadership deliberately attempted to spread a deadly disease to Native American populations with the explicit goal of extermination. Whether the specific blankets distributed at Fort Pitt successfully transmitted smallpox remains debatable, but the intent was unambiguously genocidal. The epidemic that followed killed tens of thousands and possibly as many as 100,000 Native Americans, destroying the military capacity of Pontiac's Confederacy and facilitating British colonial expansion. This was not an unfortunate accident of cultural contact, but calculated biological warfare directed at civilian populations. The incident represents a dark chapter in the history of European colonization of the Americas and serves as a powerful reminder of the genocidal violence that enabled settler colonial conquest. The story of the smallpox blankets must be remembered, taught and reckoned with as part of the honest accounting that any society owes to the victims of its historical crimes and to the descendants who continue to live with the consequences of that violence.